welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg, live on the Byline Supplement. This time, Keir Starmer's EU reset, a bold step forward or a Brexit betrayal. It covers some of the economic ground lost by the UK's departure from the European Union in 2019, a cost officially estimated at a 4% reduction of UK productivity relative to staying inside the EU. Keir Starmer has negotiated a new deal. The headlines are that the red tape, which has hindered British food exports at the European border, will be removed. Trade will become frictionless again, with the UK now accepting EU food standards. Critics say this means we'll be a rule taker, not a rule maker, but it will help exporters and therefore boost growth, one of the key aims of the government. UK citizens travelling into the EU post-Brexit with biometric passports will also be allowed to use e-gate, reducing queues for holidaymakers. Starmer's biggest concession was allowing EU fishing fleet to continue in UK waters for an additional 12 years. The fine print of a youth mobility scheme and re-entry into the Erasmus scheme for students have yet to be worked out. Joined by Mike Buckley, who is director of the Independent Commission on UK-EU relations, which aims to increase collaboration between Britain and the European Union, and the Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov. And Adam, the right-wing papers, the Brexit supporting papers have wasted no time in laying into Sir Keir Starmer. Starmer's surrender is the headline in the Daily Mail. The Daily Telegraph, kiss goodbye to Brexit. Many people seeing the damage wrought on our economy by Brexit will be saying, and a good thing too.
Yeah, it's a pretty unsurprising reaction from the right-wing press, sort of pages of screaming newspapers suggesting this is a betrayal. I mean, they're all going to, whatever that was in the deal, we were going to get this kind of reaction from the press, which kind of makes me think that perhaps Starmer could have gone a lot further and still had exactly the same reaction, in for a penny, in for a pound. So no great surprise there. What I think is telling about the reaction, though, is it is so out of line with what the public feel about Brexit now. We've had quite a bit of polling out over the last week. It shows an overwhelming consensus now for close relationships with the EU. A new YouGov poll out today showing that 66% of all British people now want the government to get closer ties with the EU, compared to just 14% who don't want that. All the polls have been showing for years now that the vast majority of Britons believe that it was a mistake to leave the EU in the first place. So all of the press really that have backed Brexit for all these years and got left is just to shout betrayal and say that this is somehow selling out the UK. I just think that's an argument that was sort of fought and lost a long time ago. I don't think that's the public. That's not really where the public are at this point.
And one issue that isn't really addressed in this agreement, except perhaps from this youth mobility scheme, is migration. And if we are to believe the architects of Brexit, and indeed many of the opponents of Brexit, Brexit was fought primarily on the issue of migration. But we have seen years of net migration growth, indeed larger net migration growth since we left the EU than we had inside it. So that's not covered in this negotiation. And we know that Sir Keir Starmer announced new migration rules that we discussed on this podcast, really. But the net migration process post-Brexit started under the Conservatives. So if that really was the issue that drove Brexit, then in a sense, that battle has already been lost by the Brexiters.
Yes, because I mean that was the main argument, or the winning argument, I'd say, for the Leave campaign during the EU referendum. This was about taking back control, and taking back control was kind of a euphemism for taking back control of borders in particular. And of course, as you say, net migration before Brexit was sort of around quarter of a million a year. That went up to 900,000 under the post-Brexit Conservative government. So that's a very difficult argument for opponents of this deal to make. Just been in the House of Commons earlier, Keir Starmer sending out his deal to MPs. Kemi Badenoch didn't even try to make the case about immigration because it's just so easy for Keir Starmer to make that point that you've just made there.
Mike, what's your take on the negotiation?
I think Keir and the government actually have done an incredibly good job, and they've gone further than lots of people thought that they would in the UK and in Brussels as well. I mean, I was having conversations even a few short weeks ago, and people didn't think that things would go as far as they have. I mean, one example is so beginning of this month, in fact, the Times published a supposed expose on negotiations saying that we wouldn't be allowed access back into the police and crime databases that we had to leave when we left the EU, which has significantly hampered our police's ability to know where criminals are, know what they're doing, know what they're planning, and then try and catch them when they've done bad things and they've escaped off to the EU. Whereas, in fact, when we get to the reset, and we have got access to those databases, which is a big win and is something that is going to keep us in Britain safer, and indeed will make Europeans safer as well. So that increased collaboration is something the government haven't really made much of a deal around, even in the last 24 hours, but I think they should be. And I think they should link that to the Defence Pact, which again, I mean, those two things collectively are going to make people in Britain safer now because we've got that greater police and crime collaboration. But we're going to be safer in the long run as well because we're going to have more ability to increase our defence capability because of having access to the extra borrowing that won't impact Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules. In good news for everybody, particularly for Rachel Reeves, maybe. So I think there's a clear argument there to make around the fact that we will be safer because of the fact that this agreement was made yesterday. And then the second argument to make to the public, I think, is that your bills are going to be lower. Food prices they're either going to come down or they will just go up less quickly than they otherwise would. I mean, no one's saying inflation is going to stop or go into reverse, but all the added costs that were put on food imports and agricultural products imports over the last few years, or at least the vast majority of those costs, are taken away and we go back to where things were prior to Brexit, just for food and agricultural products, not for anything else that's exported or imported. But that is great news, and it will have an impact on food prices. And certainly there was economists and others have said for many years that if we had implemented full incoming checks on food and agricultural goods, which we never got around to doing, but had we done that as a country, it would have put food prices up by 6%, which is a lot. And that's why the Conservative government didn't put those checks in place. That's why the Labour government didn't put those checks in place, because no government wants food prices going up by 6%.
Nevertheless,
Instead,
I think that's a really important point, Mike. And in fact, in the early days of Brexit, I did keep track of the postponements of the full food checks of food coming into the UK from the EU. And it became just initially slightly comical and in the end pointless because it was clear the UK was never going to implement those checks. Although, if we were to have a full, hard Brexit, that's exactly what it would have necessitated. And it would, like Trump's tariffs across the water, have undoubtedly increased prices for people here at home.
yeah, it would, and that's why they didn't do it. And I don't think any government ever would have done it. And we would have kept saying to the EU, yes, we'll do it in a few months. Of course, what you do have, of course, is lots of now rather redundant infrastructure built at various ports, some of which was paid, or a lot of which was paid for by industry and by the ports. So they're going to be unhappy about that. Some of that will be used for other imports that need to be checked, obviously. But I'm sure there was some agriculture specific infrastructure built. But in the scheme of things, that's a small loss. Maybe not if you're not maybe not if you're the port authority in question versus a big gain for the people of the UK and indeed the food industry in the UK and the agriculture industry in the UK and farmers who actually needed some good news. I mean, let's be fair. But the other thing, I mean, link that to energy. The energy deal that's been made, that is also going to improve household bills by bringing them down because our electricity is going to get cheaper. And in the long run, it's going to greatly increase the speed and reduce the cost of putting renewable infrastructure into the North Sea, as in wind turbines and tidal, etc. But it's also going to open up the carbon storage in the North Sea, which is mostly in British waters, to stored carbon from across the whole of Europe. So that if people are implementing carbon capture and storage, where you burn fossil fuels but capture the carbon and then store it under the sea, that will make that much more doable if anybody ever gets around to building one of those carbon capture and storage facilities.
More broadly, Adam, we're also, I think, conscious in our various discussions on the podcast and here on Byline Supplement about the changing geopolitics. And Mike has touched on this here, but the UK EU Defence Pact does give Britain to a 150 billion euro loan programme for defence procurement. And it seems slightly ironic given that the EU was initially designed as a peace project, and here we are, sadly, facing a more militaristic time. But British arms exports are a key part of our economy, and they are an area, sadly, sadly in one way, for potential growth. But we now have access to a greater, secure access to a greater market as a result of this negotiation.
Absolutely, and I mean, I said before that I think these arguments were kind of fought and lost by the Leave side a long time ago, and one of the reasons why they were fought and lost a long time ago is what happened in Ukraine, and what happened in the US presidential election with the election of Trump. The kind of argument for drawing closer to Europe in terms of defence wasn't arguable before, but it's just hit home to people in a big way over the last couple of years. And I do think there is a kind of an inevitable pull towards Europe, and this is kind of the first sign of that. I can remember back in 2016, shortly after the EU referendum, having a conversation with a couple of other journalists, and we were trying to predict how this is all going to play out. And I said at the time, I think we'll eventually, after a lot of negotiations, leave the EU, and then we'll spend 10, 15, 20 years sort of gradually getting back to where we started for a series of further negotiations. And nothing that's happened since then has really sort of changed my opinion on that. Now, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to end up back inside the EU altogether, but I do think it's very likely that we will end up in a situation where this is just the first step of a gradual reintegration back into Europe. A series of more. I mean, Mike has, in his article today, wrote that there's quite a lot missing from this deal. There's nothing on services, and there's nothing on the live music industry, which has been badly hit by Brexit. I think over time, these things will gradually be negotiated by the UK over 5, 10, 15 years. And we could be in a situation where we end up sort of something like Switzerland, where we're sort of in these sort of permanent negotiations, but we do end up, we're getting a lot of the benefits of close relations with Europe, but not all of the benefits. But of course, we could end up in a situation where it gets to a point where we may as well rejoin the EU, rather than having this sort of incredibly complex relationship which is the way we currently seem to be heading.
Well, indeed, and the point I raised in my introduction, really, and which is a true one, I think, from the critics, that when it comes to food, for example, the UK will be a rule taker, not a rule maker. Well, yes, because we're not in the European Union. But Mike, talk to me specifically about this fishing deal, because this does appear to be the one big loss. The Sun encapsulated it with their headline today, "Stitched up like a kipper." Of course, we have to contextualise this and say that the deal, which allowed EU fishing fleets 75% of their quotas after we left the European Union, was already in place. This was not something that Sir Keir Starmer negotiated, but it was due to run out next year, at which point a further negotiation would have taken place. So that was potentially a bargaining chip for the UK. Presumably, Sir Keir Starmer attempted to use that, or did use that, in return for frictionless borders on food exports. But that will be felt by fishing communities in the UK, and it will be perceived as a big negative.
It will, but I mean, the news really is that nothing has changed. The deal was made, 4 or 5 years ago by Boris Johnson. That deal is just going to continue for the next 14 years. So if you want to blame somebody or the fishing industry, want to blame somebody, then I would suggest that you blame Boris Johnson rather than Keir Starmer. It has been rolled over for 14 years. I don't work in the fishing industry. Keir says that stability for 14 years is much better than annual negotiations. I would think that is probably true. It is also true, though, that in any negotiation with the EU, we are perpetually going to be the smaller partner because they are huge and we are not. And if we want them to do nice things for us, like an agreement on food and agriculture, or like bringing our energy system into the EU market, or like letting us take part in their 150 billion defence borrowing fund and enabling our defence industry to sell into the whole of the EU, plus Norway, which is going to be pretty substantial, I would imagine, in terms of net sales for UK defence industry. If we want any of those things or anything else, we're going to have to roll over when they say this is a red line for us, which is why we've seen what happened with fisheries, and is why we will almost certainly see a youth mobility scheme go forward at some point. I am slightly sceptical on that one. I mean, I hope it happens, because for me on that one, that's just about generational fairness. Pretty much everybody under the age of 30 was too young to vote in the referendum, for obvious reasons, but they are the most restricted group of young people in Europe. They can't travel, they can't work, they can't fall in love, they can't just go for a long holiday, they can't get an education, they can't get an apprenticeship somewhere else in Europe. Pretty much every peer of their peers in Europe can do that. So for me,
That's a
this,
bit of
this is just about
right,
generational
right,
fairness. I really
right.
hope it happens, and I hope the government doesn't just kick it into the long grass.
Yeah, I mean that is a bit of an exaggeration. Isn't it? Young people can go and travel in the European Union. They can't
Well,
go
yeah, they can, but then they have to come
for
back.
an extended period of time, and they can go and study in the EU if they pay the appropriate fees for.
Yeah, but it's much more difficult. It's much more
You
complicated. Whereas before, you just went and did it, and no, I mean, the rest of Europe, the young people don't need to think about it. Our young people need to jump through a whole set of hoops, and if they do go and do it, it's going to cost them a lot more. But anyway, to go back to my point, the original point was that when the EU wants something, we just have to roll over if we want something back. Because in the original Brexit agreement, the EU pretty much got everything it wanted. We didn't get anywhere near what we should have asked for, mostly because we didn't ask for it, to be fair. That means now we've got a very long list of asks. They've got quite a short list of asks, but fishing is very, very much on their list and will remain so in perpetuity.
I mean, a couple of things I'd say about the fishing. I do think the impact of this has been somewhat overstated. I mean, obviously, a large proportion of the fish that is taken from British waters is exported to Europe anyway, so it won't be affected by that, number one. And also, the size of the UK fishing industry is really tiny compared to most other major sectors in the UK. I think it's something like 0.03% of economic contribution to the UK, which isn't much more than, say, tattoo shops. In terms of the amount of people that it employs, it's there are universities that employ more people than there are the entire fishing industry. So I think the sort of blanket coverage that this issue of fishing has got in the last week, particularly on the front pages of the British press, I think is grossly out of scale with the actual reality of where fishing sits in the UK economy in 2025.
Mike, just explain the energy deal then. You say that this will leave us paying cheaper energy prices going forward. How does that work?
So, well, our energy sector was excluded from the EU just like everything else. So that makes it more expensive to transfer energy through interconnectors. It means that we are of less, we're kind of at the back of the queue when it comes to trading energy, particularly electricity. It means there's a big line down the North Sea, just like there's a big line border down the Irish Sea. That makes it much more difficult to put renewable infrastructure in the North Sea. Putting the UK energy system back into the EU system means that investment can take place much more easily. We're going to align what's called ETS and CBAM, so that's electricity trading system and carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is about enabling electricity to be traded more easily, and it's also about putting a carbon price on carbon that is produced in both the EU and the UK. If those systems were different, that would just be additional cost for industry, which would inevitably be passed on to you in your electricity bill. If those systems are the same, that reduces those costs. It's also going to mean that more interconnectors are going to be built, and it's going to mean that we will be prioritised the same as any EU nation if we get to a point where there is a restriction on electricity supply. And you'll have seen recently the blackouts in Spain and Portugal. I don't know how true this is, but Portugal are blaming France and saying, well, you didn't send us the energy you were supposed to send us because we've got an agreement. With us outside of the EU energy system, we would always be at the back of the queue if there was a shortage of energy. Now we're back in, we should have the same placement as anybody in the EU. So that should maximise the security of our electricity supply, therefore reducing the likelihood of blackouts. But the main gain for people, not that you'll notice, because obviously it's counterfactual, you're not going to notice your bill not going up because it hasn't gone up. But in reality, your electricity bill will be cheaper forever because this happened. And that is genuinely really good news. It's also really good news that we're going to get more renewable energy capacity built and more quickly and more cheaply in the North Sea, because that's a very quick, easy, well, it's not necessarily hugely quick and easy way. I mean, I couldn't do it, but it is a quicker and easier way of generating renewable capacity for the whole of Europe, which will obviously have a consequent benefit for us and indeed the whole world in the long run. That's a big win. And this is both of these things are things that the energy sector has been asking for, very articulately and competently. And I've done quite a lot of work with them, and I know that they've been in direct contact with our government, with the EU as well. So I was really pleased to see the EU and the UK agree yesterday to effectively do what the energy industry have been asking them to do. And that is genuinely, it's a big win for us, and it's a big win for bills, and it's a big win for the planet.
Adam, I want to ask you about the political fallout from this, because as I say, if we accept the argument that underneath it all, the EU referendum was about immigration. That wasn't, I can't emphasize this enough, other than the potential mobility scheme and rejoining Erasmus, that wasn't addressed in this negotiation. Net migration has risen every year since Brexit, and that happened initially under a Conservative government. How can the Conservatives seek to claim the high ground, the moral high ground on this against Sir Keir Starmer? I mean, I've no doubt they will attempt, but how can they? How can Reform UK, which I know that, for example, Baroness Hoey, who is a former Labour MP, but it seems to me, very right-leaning member of the House of Lords and a passionate Brexit supporter, saying that this will drive Labour supporters into the arms of reform. But I'm not sure how so, or at least I'm not sure how logically that might be so.
I think the answer to your question, how can they make this argument, is that they can't, essentially. We just had a long statement by the Prime Minister in response from Kemi Badenoch, and she really struggled in her response to Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister's statement, compared to his statement the week before about immigration, all the difficulties he got into last week, he seemed massively more comfortable on this ground of talking about the deals that he's making for the UK. He talked not just about the EU deal, but the deal with India last week, the sort of mini agreement with the US as well. And that's I think the fact that the Prime Minister feels so confident, visibly so confident talking about this, shows how much the debate has moved on from recent years. And that was a long period where the debate wasn't moving. So the public support in the polls shifted against Brexit years ago. But in Westminster, the debate hasn't moved until now. So in the run-up to the general election, Keir Starmer was talking a lot about making Brexit work. There'll be no backpedaling on Brexit, etc., etc. None of the major parties went into that general election last year promising an immediate return to the single market customs union, let alone return to the EU. I think what's happened since the election, in terms of Trump's actions in particular, have just made the argument for pro-Europeans of getting closer to Europe just completely unarguable. And it's really put the Conservative Party and Reform in a difficult position. I thought it was telling today as well in the House of Commons, Nigel Farage was absent from the chamber. Now, I don't know where he was instead, but it was telling that he didn't feel that this was the moment for him to come and make his argument. And often you'll notice that there's kind of Brexiteers are now moving on to other arguments other than Brexit. You don't actually hear Nigel Farage talking much about Brexit these days. He talks about lots of other things, about net zero, grooming gangs, whatever it might be. The sort of Brexiteers are losing the argument. And you could tell that today. There was a tweet from a Talk TV presenter sent out today where he said, I don't like this agreement on e-passport queues. I like going in the long queues. And I think if the pro-Brexit argument has been reduced to I like queues, then we're really onto a loser.
I read a very interesting piece by Rod Liddle, who's a right-wing, what would you call him, polemicist would be a polite word, in the Sunday Times at the weekend when he went to Teesside. He went to Middlesbrough, to a ward or a constituency, I can't remember which was the most pro-Brexit in the country, and saying that actually it doesn't seem to matter now. I kind of think it should matter. I think it should matter in terms of how people view Nigel Farage and how people view the Reform Party. I think you published Reform, and maybe you mentioned research, I think, a little earlier, showing that Reform were pulling away from Labour in the polling. Yet, if we accept the argument that Brexit has caused economic damage to this country, that it has failed to solve the, and I stress this in heavily inverted commas, the problem of migration, the problem as it is perceived to be by pro-Brexiters. And there are precious little upsides that can be shown for Brexit. Why the hell is Farage, why the hell are Reform not being punished in the polls and at the ballot box? Why are they still apparently gaining support?
Well, this is there is a debate inside Labour. I'm sure Mike can talk to this as well about how is best to take on Farage. So we've seen kind of one version of how to take on Farage over the last couple of weeks from Keir Starmer, which is essentially to accept the argument on immigration, accept that or to suggest that he's lost the argument on immigration, and try and out Farage on those terms. So far, that doesn't seem to be working. So as you say, we had a poll out today which showed Reform 7 points ahead. The other argument for how to take on Farage is pin things like Brexit on him. Say, look, this is what you were demanding. You gave us Brexit. You've boasted about giving us Brexit. You can see we're now having to clear up your mess. And so Keir Starmer has kind of avoided making that argument. I think there are some signs, I think particularly in his statement today, that he's kind of dipping his toe into that, into trying to lay the blame, not just on Reform, but on the Conservative Party for the deal that they got originally on Brexit and for how badly it's gone wrong, and to say, look, we're a new government, we're clearing up the mess. But I think in order to do that, you do have to pin, I think Labour quite successfully pinned Liz Truss's budget on the Conservative Party. I think they've been less successful in pinning Brexit on the Conservative Party and particularly on pinning it on Reform. But I think if they do want to defeat Nigel Farage, I do think that's the way they have to go, personally.
Mike?
I think it's difficult for now. Maybe it could have been done a few years ago. But I think it's difficult now for the government, for the Labour Party, to pin Brexit on Farage, because Farage has the perfect comeback, which is, well, I didn't do it. You know, had I implemented it, he would say it would have been brilliant and everything would have been wonderful, and we would all have had unicorns and, you know, jacuzzis in the back garden and all of it. He can point to the Conservatives as well and say they did a bad job of implementing it. And people who like Farage will give him the benefit of the doubt, I'm afraid. I do think that politicians on all sides should have criticised Nigel Farage for the idea of Brexit, and indeed, I mean, you know, they could ask him what a better deal would look like, and he doesn't have an answer to that question. But I think retrospectively, it's quite hard to pin it on him. It's also relatively hard to pin it on the Conservatives because it's all a long time ago. I mean, fair enough, it was Boris Johnson's deal, but Boris Johnson is a long time ago, you know? And the Labour Party chose a long time ago to decide that they were going to support the principle of Brexit and say, we're not against Brexit, we're not going to undo it, we're not going to rejoin the single market, we're not going to rejoin the customs union, we're going to make Brexit work. I mean, in reality, yes, you can make Brexit work better. And yesterday is an example of that. We're going to have annual summits. I would imagine this is now going to become an annual occurrence where we have an annual summit with the EU and the government then claims it's got some kind of a better deal. And I think there will be a better deal. You know, there are other wins to be had before we hit a hard point where you can't go any further as a third country, as a non-EU member. But it's hard, therefore, for the Labour Party to turn around now and say, oh, the deal was terrible. Boris Johnson did a very bad thing. I mean, Labour voted for the deal, if you remember.
I do remember that. And in fact, we discussed that on a recent podcast, Mike, and that was a political choice taken by Sir Keir Starmer, wishing to appear statesmanlike.
Yeah.
Some Labour MPs argued, I mean, we have to remember the horrible impasse that had preceded the election of Boris Johnson in the UK Parliament and choking our democracy, really, or the negotiations around Brexit were. And it was a horrible moment in British politics. And Starmer wanted to appear statesmanlike by backing the Brexit legislation brought forward by Boris Johnson. Some Labour MPs wanted to oppose it. Many wanted to abstain, and some did. I think 37 abstained in the actual vote. But the majority of Labour MPs voted for it, which, as you say,
that's what they were told to do.
well,
but it's also slightly difficult.
Yeah,
because
whether
the EU
that was the right
actually,
thing
the
to
EU
do.
were very proud of their deal.
Sorry,
And
Mike.
so wandering around and saying it's a terrible deal doesn't make the EU happy. So if you want the EU to play ball, you need to respect the deal as actually a very robust deal and probably the most advanced free trade agreement in the world. But it's not wrong to recognise its deficiencies and to recognise that it hasn't been anywhere near as good as membership. But the EU will just say, well, it was never going to be anywhere near as good as membership. That's what you wanted. We gave you what you wanted.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just a few comments coming in. Michael D. Stefano says young people are not free without restrictions to travel in the European Union. Well, they are for 90 days of the year, I think, Michael. He says there is no universal healthcare now for British citizens, and this cannot last. The inequality of the whole thing will end. And Den Howlett on the whole fishing debate makes, I think, quite an opposite comment. What does the commentariat know? Do they know a turbot from a sherbet? I suspect in most cases not. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining in. It's been really fascinating. Thank you to Mike. Great to speak to you, Mike. I hope you join us more often. And thank you to Adam Bienkov, the Byline Times political editor. And if you're listening to this later as an edition of the Byline podcast, it was produced by me, Adrian Goldberg, in Birmingham. And if you want to support our work, by the way, then do join Byline Supplement on Substack. Take out a paid subscription if you can. Loads of great reading, including from people like Mike and by Adam. And take out a subscription as well to the brilliant Byline Times, our wonderful monthly news publication, which drops with a satisfying smack on your doormat every month. And that contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. So do head over to bylinetimes.com to take out a subscription. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Adam. And thank you for listening and watching. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian.